There's something about watching everything you've built slip through your fingers that changes a man. For Caleb Hayes, an aging rancher facing foreclosure, every sunrise felt like a countdown to losing the only home he'd ever known. His wealthy neighbor Thorne had been circling like a vulture, offering to buy his worthless land for mere pennies. Then one morning, Caleb noticed something strange in his barn, a mound of fresh dirt that kept growing back no matter how many times he swept it away. What he thought was a simple pest problem would lead him down a hidden tunnel and straight into the biggest discovery of his life. But what was his greedy neighbor really digging for beneath Caleb's barn? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air carried the bite of early autumn as Caleb Hayes stepped onto the weathered planks of his front porch. His boots, worn thin at the heels, made that familiar hollow sound against the wood, the same sound his father's boots had made, and his grandfather's before that. He was 67 years old, and every one of those years had been spent on this land, carved from the high desert country where Montana kisses the Wyoming border. The sun had not yet cleared the eastern ridge, but Caleb had been awake for an hour already. Sleep came harder these days, and when it did come, it brought dreams of Sarah. 3 years she'd been gone, and still he'd wake in the darkness reaching for her, finding only the cool emptiness of sheets that had once held the warmth of 42 years together. He pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest, a habit so ingrained he barely noticed doing it anymore. The silver case was worn smooth from decades of handling, the engraving on the back nearly invisible now. "To my son, may you always have time to do what's right." His father had given it to him on his 21st birthday, the same day they'd buried his grandfather. 3 generations of Hayes men, all bound to this unforgiving stretch of rock and sage. 5:47. Time to start the day. Rusty emerged from beneath the porch, his blue-gray coat dusted with the red dirt that covered everything out here. The old healer was 12 now, moving slower than he used to, but his eyes still held that sharp intelligence that made him worth 3 ranch hands. He'd been Sarah's dog, really. She'd picked him from a litter over in Billings, named him for the color of autumn leaves she'd loved so much. Now he was all Caleb had left of those better days. "Come on, boy," Caleb said, his voice rough from disuse. "Cows won't feed themselves." The ranch house sat at the end of a mile-long dirt road that wound through terrain most folks would call inhospitable. Rocky soil, sparse grass, and winters that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. His grandfather had homesteaded this section in 1889, convinced that hard work and determination could make anything grow. He'd been half right. The Hayes family had survived here for 3 generations, but thriving, that was another matter entirely. Caleb made his way to the barn. Rusty trotting ahead with that peculiar sideways gait working dogs develop after years of herding. The structure loomed against the lightening sky, its red paint long since faded to the color of dried blood. His grandfather had built this barn with his own hands, using timber hauled from the mountains 40 miles north. It had withstood 100 years of wind and weather, but now it leaned slightly to the east, its foundations settling with age. Inside, the familiar smells embraced him: hay and leather, dust and animal warmth. He had 43 head of cattle left. There'd been nearly 200 when Sarah was alive, when they could afford to hire help and maintain the fences properly. But medical bills had a way of eating through a lifetime of savings, and after she passed, Caleb found he couldn't keep up with it all alone. He forked hay into the feeding troughs, his shoulder protesting with each lift. The work that had once been effortless now took twice as long and hurt 3 times as much. But routine was all he had left, and he clung to it the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. "You're up early." Caleb turned to find Sheriff Tom Brennan standing in the barn doorway, his considerable frame backlit by the rising sun. They'd gone to school together 60 years ago, played football on the same team, courted girls at the same dances. Tom had gone off to the service, come back and pinned on a badge. Caleb had stayed and worked the land. "Don't sleep much anymore," Caleb said, setting down the pitchfork. "Coffee's on if you want some." They walked back to the house in companionable silence, the kind that only develops between men who've known each other long enough to find comfort in quiet. Inside, Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee so strong it could strip paint, and they sat at the kitchen table where Sarah's photograph watched them from the mantel. "Got some news you're not going to like," Tom said, pulling a folded envelope from his jacket pocket. "Bank sent this over to my office yesterday, asked me to deliver it personal." Caleb took the envelope, already knowing what it would say. He'd been expecting it for months. The letterhead confirmed his suspicion. First National Bank of Copper Ridge. Foreclosure proceedings to commence in 90 days unless outstanding balance of $73,000 was paid in full. 90 days, Caleb said, setting the letter aside like it was nothing more than a grocery list. "Well, that's something." "Caleb, I appreciate you bringing it out, Tom. Saved me a trip to town." The sheriff studied him with those cop eyes that had learned to see through 40 years of lies and evasions. "You got a plan?" "Always got a plan." Caleb sipped his coffee, bitter and black. "Right now the plan is to finish my morning chores. This isn't the time for pride, old friend. There are programs. I'm not taking charity." "It's not charity, it's—" "Tom," Caleb's voice was quiet but firm, "I appreciate the concern. I do. But this land has been in my family for 3 generations. I'm not going to be the one who loses it." The sheriff sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of Caleb's jaw. He'd seen it before, usually right before Caleb did something foolish and noble. "Marcus Thorne stopped by my office last week." The name hung in the air between them like a bad smell. Marcus Thorne, the man who owned everything in Copper Ridge that was worth owning, and most of what wasn't. He'd made his fortune in mining operations down in Arizona, then moved north 5 years ago and started buying up property. His estate bordered Caleb's land to the east, a sprawling compound that looked like something out of a magazine, complete with a mansion that would have been more at home in Beverly Hills than the high desert. "He's been asking about you," Tom continued. "Wanted to know if the bank had moved forward with foreclosure yet, seemed mighty interested in your land." "He's made offers before," Caleb said. "Insulting ones. He mentioned he might be willing to go higher. Said something about wanting to expand his holdings, create a continuous property line. This land isn't for sale, even if it means losing it to the bank." Caleb looked out the window at the sunrise, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange. "My grandfather used to say that a man who won't stand for something will fall for anything. This land might not look like much to folks like Thorne, but it's mine. My father's buried out there on the ridge, next to my mother. Sarah's out there too. This is Hayes land, and it'll stay Hayes land as long as I'm breathing." Tom nodded slowly, finishing his coffee. He'd expected nothing less. "Well, the offer stands if you change your mind. Thorne left me his number." "I won't change my mind." After the sheriff left, Caleb sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the foreclosure notice. $73,000. It might as well have been 73 million. He pulled out his father's watch again, reading the inscription he'd memorized decades ago. "May you always have time to do what's right." "What would you do, Pop?" he asked the empty room, but he already knew the answer. His father would have worked the problem from every angle, would have found a way to hold on to the land no matter what it took. Hayes' men didn't quit. He spent the rest of the morning mending fence line, sweating under the climbing sun despite the autumn chill. The physical work helped settle his mind, helped him think. There had to be a way out of this. He could sell off the remaining cattle, but that would only buy him another month or 2. He could take a loan from someone in town, but who had that kind of money to spare? The whole county was struggling. By noon, he'd worked himself to exhaustion and still had no answers. He returned to the barn to put away his tools, Rusty following at his heels. The dog had that alert posture he got when something wasn't quite right, his ears pricked forward, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" Rusty moved to the far corner of the barn, the section Caleb used for storage. The dog sniffed at the ground, whined low in his throat, then looked back at Caleb as if asking a question. That's when Caleb noticed it, a mound of fresh dirt, maybe 6 inches high, piled against the wall. He frowned, trying to remember if it had been there that morning. He didn't think so, but then again, he'd been distracted by Tom's visit and the foreclosure notice. Badger, probably, he muttered, grabbing a broom. Or a groundhog getting ready for winter. He swept the dirt away, making a mental note to set a trap later. The last thing he needed was some animal undermining his barn's foundation. With everything else going wrong, that would be just his luck. He spent the afternoon in town, buying supplies he could barely afford and avoiding the pitying looks from shopkeepers who'd surely heard about his troubles. Small towns were like that. Everyone knew your business before you did. By the time he returned home, the sun was setting, painting the sky in those deep purples and oranges that Sarah had loved so much. He fed the cattle, checked the water troughs, and made himself a simple dinner of beans and bread. As darkness fell, he sat on the porch with Rusty at his feet, watching the stars emerge one by one. Out here, away from town lights, the night sky was a canvas of silver light, so thick with stars it looked like someone had spilled sugar across black velvet. This was what he was fighting for, not just the land, but these moments of quiet peace, this connection to something larger than himself. His grandfather had sat on this same porch and watched these same stars. His father had done the same. And if there was any justice in the world, someday a 4th generation of Hayes would sit here and remember them all. But justice, Caleb knew, was a rare commodity in this world. More often than not, men like Thorne got what they wanted simply because they had the money and power to take it. Men like Caleb just held on as long as they could before the inevitable happened. He touched the pocket watch in his vest one more time before heading inside. The house felt too empty these days, too quiet without Sarah's presence to fill it. He climbed the stairs to the bedroom they'd shared for 4 decades, changed into his nightclothes, and lay down on his side of the bed, the side he'd always slept on, leaving her side untouched as if she might return at any moment. Sleep came slowly, and when it finally did, he dreamed of tunnels stretching into darkness, of secrets buried in the earth, and of his father's voice whispering that same old wisdom. May you always have time to do what's right. In the barn below, unnoticed in the darkness, the mound of fresh dirt had returned, larger than before. 3 days passed, and the dirt mound kept returning. Caleb swept it away each morning, and each morning it reappeared larger than before. By the 4th day, it had grown to nearly 2 feet high, a pyramid of loose red earth that seemed to mock his attempts to clear it. He'd set 2 traps, both of which had been triggered, but remained empty. Whatever was digging down there was either too smart or too large for standard pest control. "All right," he said to Rusty on the 5th morning, standing over the mound with his hands on his hips. "Enough is enough." The dog sat at attention, watching him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than they should. Caleb had learned to trust Rusty's instincts over the years, and right now those instincts were telling him something was wrong. The dog hadn't gone near that corner since the dirt first appeared, keeping his distance like he could smell something dangerous beneath the surface. Caleb retrieved a spading shovel from the tool rack and set to work. If there was a den down there, he'd dig it out and collapse it. Then he'd pour concrete over the whole area and be done with it. He couldn't afford to have his barn's foundation compromised by some industrious rodent. The first few scoops came away easily loose dirt that hadn't been packed down. But as he dug deeper, he struck something that made the shovel ring like a bell. Wood. He cleared away more dirt, revealing weathered timbers set in a framework that looked disturbingly deliberate. This wasn't a burrow, this was construction. His pulse quickened. He knelt down, brushing away dirt with his hands now, uncovering more of the timber structure. It was a shaft, maybe 3 feet square, braced with boards that showed saw marks. Someone had built this. Recently, too, The wood wasn't weathered enough to be old. What in the world? The ground gave way beneath him. One moment he was kneeling on solid earth, the next he was falling into darkness, dirt and debris cascading around him. He landed hard on his shoulder, the impact driving the air from his lungs. For a long moment he lay there in the darkness, stunned and disoriented, trying to understand what had just happened. Above him, Rusty barked frantically, his silhouette visible against the circle of daylight that marked the hole Caleb had fallen through. The drop had been maybe 8 feet, not enough to break anything, but enough to knock the sense out of him temporarily. He sat up slowly, taking inventory. His shoulder throbbed where he'd landed, and his left hand was scraped raw, but nothing felt broken. He blinked, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the gloom. Gradually, shapes emerged from the darkness. He was in a tunnel, a proper tunnel, with timber supports and a packed earth floor. It stretched away from him in both directions, disappearing into blackness. His first thought was an old mine shaft. His grandfather had worked the copper mines before homesteading, and there were abandoned shafts scattered throughout these hills. But those had all been mapped and filled in decades ago. This tunnel was different. The timbers were new. The air still smelled of fresh-turned earth. Caleb's mind raced. Someone had dug this tunnel, under his barn. Recently, he needed light. Looking up at the opening, he called out to Rusty, "Stay, boy. I'll be right back." The dog whined but remained at his post, faithful as always. Caleb fumbled in his pocket for his lighter, an old Zippo he'd carried since his army days. The flame sputtered to life, casting a weak orange glow that barely pushed back the darkness. It would have to do. He began walking, following the tunnel in the direction that led away from his barn. The tunnel ran straight and true, angling slightly downward. Every 10 feet or so, timber supports braced the ceiling and walls, professionally done. This wasn't amateur work. Someone with mining experience had built this. Then he remembered in the corner of the barn, tucked away in a wooden crate with his grandfather's old belongings, there was a mining lantern. The old man had used it in his youth, working the copper veins up north. Caleb rarely opened that crate, but he knew exactly where it was. He retraced his steps to the opening and called up, "Rusty, get back." The dog reluctantly moved away from the hole. Caleb used the timber supports as a ladder, hauling himself back up through the opening. His shoulder protested every movement, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He found the crate buried under old tack and spare tools. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was his grandfather's carbide lantern, a battered brass fixture that had probably been old even when his grandfather first carried it into the mines. Caleb inspected it carefully. The reservoir still held calcium carbide, dried but intact. He added water from his canteen, and after a few attempts managed to get the striker working. A bright white flame hissed to life, pushing back the shadows with authority. "Stay here," he told Rusty firmly, then lowered himself back into the tunnel. With proper light, the passage took on new dimensions. He could see now that the tunnel was approximately 5 feet high, tall enough to walk hunched over, and 4 feet wide. The walls were smooth, carved with precision. Tool marks showed in the compressed earth, evidence of recent excavation. He moved forward, the lantern held high, following the tunnel as it stretched into the distance. His mind wrestled with implications. Someone had dug this tunnel under his property, someone with resources and skill, someone who didn't want him to know about it. Marcus Thorne. The name came to him with sudden certainty. Thorne had been trying to buy this land for 2 years, making increasingly aggressive offers. When Caleb refused to sell, Thorne had turned hostile, using his influence to make life difficult wherever he could. But this was something else entirely. This was trespassing. This was theft. But theft of what? What could possibly be worth tunneling under his land for? This wasn't exactly prime real estate. The soil was rocky and poor, barely suitable for grazing cattle. There was no water to speak of, no minerals. Caleb stopped walking. His grandfather had worked the copper mines. had talked about the veins that ran through these hills, networks of mineral deposits that stretched for miles underground. Most had been played out decades ago, but some, no, he whispered to the empty tunnel. It couldn't be. He pressed forward with renewed urgency, counting his steps. 100 yards, 200. The tunnel continued straight, never wavering, heading in a direction he was beginning to recognize, east, toward Thorne's property. At approximately 300 yards, the tunnel ended at a wall of newer timbers, a barrier that had been deliberately constructed. But there was a gap at the top, and through it, Caleb could hear something. Voices, faint and distant, but unmistakably human. He extinguished the lantern and pressed his ear to the gap. The voices became clearer. Men talking, words echoing in what sounded like a larger space. Another week at most. The vein extends at least another 100 yards. Does the old man suspect? Hayes? No chance. He thinks he's got a groundhog problem. Laughter, harsh and dismissive. What about the surveyors? They're asking questions. Let them ask. By the time they figure out what we're doing here, we'll have extracted enough copper to make this whole operation worthwhile. The old fool is sitting on a fortune and doesn't even know it. Caleb's blood ran cold. He recognized the second voice now, not Thorne himself, but Reed, his foreman, a hard man with a harder reputation who'd been with Thorne since he moved to Copper Ridge. They were mining under his land, stealing from him, and from the sound of it, they'd been at it for weeks, maybe months. He backed away from the barrier, his mind reeling. This changed everything. This wasn't just about a foreclosure anymore. This was about theft on a massive scale. If there really was copper under his land, valuable copper, then he wasn't broke after all. He was sitting on a fortune, but he needed proof. He needed to see what was on the other side of that barrier, needed to understand the full scope of what Thorne was doing. Most importantly, he needed to document it before Thorne realized he'd been discovered. Caleb made his way back through the tunnel, moving as quickly as he could in the confined space. His mind was already 3 steps ahead, planning. He'd need a camera, he'd need witnesses. He'd need to move fast before Thorne discovered the collapsed section and realized his tunnel had been breached. He emerged back into his barn, blinking in the bright daylight. Rusty rushed to him, tail wagging with relief. Caleb knelt and hugged the old dog, his hands shaking with a mixture of rage and excitement. "Good boy," he whispered. "Good boy for telling me something was wrong." He looked at the hole in the barn floor, at the fresh dirt scattered around it. For the first time in 3 years since Sarah's death, he felt something other than resignation. He felt hope, and beneath that hope, like bedrock under soil, he felt a cold, hard determination. Thorne had made a critical mistake. He'd assumed Caleb was just a broken-down old rancher, too tired and too poor to fight back. He'd assumed wrong. Caleb Hayes might have been many things, but he'd never been a quitter. And now, with proof of Thorne's theft literally beneath his feet, he finally had something to fight with. He just had to figure out how to use it before Thorne realized what had happened. Caleb spent the rest of that day in the tunnel, sketching a rough map and taking measurements with a tape measure he'd found in his toolbox. He worked by the light of his grandfather's lantern, the familiar hiss of burning carbide, a strange comfort in the underground darkness. Every few minutes he'd stop and listen, worried that Thorne's men might discover the breach, but the only sounds were his own breathing and the occasional shifting of earth. By evening, he had what he needed, a detailed map showing the tunnel's path from his barn to what he believed was Thorne's cellar, along with measurements that would prove the excavation had been done from Thorne's side. The tunnel had been driven west, under Caleb's property, with surgical precision. He climbed out of the hole, covered it with a tarp and some loose boards to keep Rusty safe, and went into the house. His whole body ached from the day's exertion, but his mind was racing too fast for rest. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. More importantly, he needed to understand his rights. In the study, a small room off the kitchen that Sarah had always called his paper cave, Caleb pulled out the metal filing cabinet where he kept important documents. birth certificates, marriage license, Sarah's death certificate, and beneath those, in a leather portfolio that had belonged to his grandfather, the land deed. He spread the yellow document on the desk, squinting at the formal language and elaborate calligraphy. The deed dated to 1889, signed by a territorial governor whose name Caleb couldn't quite make out. But one section caught his attention, and he read it slowly, his lips moving with the words, including all mineral rights, water rights, and subsurface assets in perpetuity. There it was, in black and white. His family owned not just the surface land, but everything beneath it. If there was copper under his property, it belonged to him. And if Thorne had been extracting that copper without permission, he'd been stealing. But knowing his rights and proving theft were two different things. He needed help, and there was only one person he trusted enough to share this with. He found Tom Brennan at the sheriff's office, just finishing up paperwork before heading home. The older man looked up when Caleb walked in, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Caleb, everything all right?" "I need to show you something," Caleb said quietly, "and I need you to promise you'll hear me out before you say anything." Tom's cop instincts went on alert. He'd known Caleb long enough to recognize when something serious was happening. He closed the file he'd been working on, removed his reading glasses, and gave Caleb his full attention. "I'm listening." Caleb laid out the land deed first, then the map he'd drawn. As he talked, describing the tunnel, the overheard conversation, and what it all meant, he watched Tom's expression shift from skepticism to shock to cold anger. "Under your barn," Tom repeated slowly. "You're telling me Marcus Thorne dug a tunnel under your barn to steal copper from your land?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And you went down there yourself, into an unmapped tunnel that could have collapsed at any moment." "I had my grandfather's lantern." "That's not the point, Caleb. You could have been killed. You should have called me first." "And said what?" "That I had a dirt mound in my barn. You'd have told me to set a trap and call animal control." Tom couldn't argue with that. He studied the map, his jaw working the way it did when he was thinking hard about something. "This is serious, Caleb. If what you're saying is true, we're talking about major theft, trespassing, possibly fraud, but we need real evidence. Your word against Thorne's won't be enough, especially given his connections." "I know. That's why I'm here. I need to know what my options are." Tom leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "Well, first thing tomorrow I can get a warrant to search Thorne's property. If there's a tunnel entrance in his cellar like you think, that's physical evidence. But Thorne's got expensive lawyers. They'll fight it, claim the tunnel was already there, that they didn't know where it led. We need more." "What kind of more?" "We need to prove they've been extracting copper. We need samples, documentation, evidence of sale or storage. And we need to prove they knew they were on your land when they did it." Caleb felt a weight settling on his shoulders. "So it's not enough that I found the tunnel. It's a start. It's a damn good start. But Thorne's got resources, and he's got pull with people who matter. We go after him with half a case, and he'll bury us in legal fees until you can't afford to fight anymore." The truth of that settled between them like a stone. Caleb had 73,000 in debt and 90 days until foreclosure. A protracted legal battle would bankrupt him long before justice was served. "There's something else," Tom said carefully. "I did some checking after Thorne came by asking about you. His company filed mineral exploration permits for his property about 6 months ago. Claims he's prospecting for copper on his own land. But he's not on his own land. He's under mine. I know that. You know that. But on paper, it looks legitimate. He's got surveyor's reports, geological assessments, all properly filed. If we accuse him of trespassing, he'll just say the tunnel was necessary for structural support of his mining operation, that it didn't actually cross your property line. But it does cross the line. I measured it. Your measurements against his professional surveyors? In court, that's not a fight you win. Court, Caleb felt the hope that had been building since his discovery start to crumble. Of course, Thorne had covered his tracks. Men like him always did. They had lawyers and accountants whose entire job was making illegal things look legal. "So, what do I do?" he asked, and hated how defeated he sounded. Tom was quiet for a long moment, then leaned forward. "You do what you've always done, old friend. You don't give up. We need to be smart about this. Build a case so solid that Thorne can't wiggle out of it. And in the meantime, you keep quiet about what you found. If Thorne realizes you know about the tunnel, he'll shut down the operation, destroy the evidence, and you'll have nothing." "How long?" "Give me a week. Let me do some digging, talk to some people I trust. The county surveyor owes me a favor. Maybe he can take a look at Thorne's permits, find something irregular. And I'll reach out to the State Mining Commission, see if there have been any complaints or violations." Caleb nodded slowly. A week. He could manage a week, assuming Thorne's men didn't discover the collapse and realize their tunnel had been breached. In the meantime, Tom continued, "You shore up that opening, make it look like you fixed a structural problem. Don't do anything that might tip them off, and for God's sake, stay out of that tunnel. If something happens to you down there, I'll have to arrest myself for negligence." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing. Caleb stood, folding up his map and the deed. "Thanks, Tom. I mean it." "Don't thank me yet. We've got a long road ahead, and Thorne's not going to go down easy." As Caleb drove home in the darkness, his headlights cutting through the desert night, he thought about his father's watch and its inscription, "May you always have time to do what's right." He had 90 days before foreclosure, 1 week before Tom could start building a case, and an unknown amount of time before Thorne discovered what Caleb knew. Time was running out, but he wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. Back at the ranch, he stood in the barn looking down at the covered hole, Rusty pressed against his leg. Somewhere beneath his feet, Thorne's men were stealing his future. But they'd made a mistake by bringing their theft to his doorstep. Now it was just a question of whether Caleb could prove it before time ran out. Caleb spent the next 3 days playing the part of a man with nothing more on his mind than basic survival. He fed his cattle, mended fence, and made a show of repairing the barn floor where the collapse had occurred. To anyone watching, and he had to assume someone was watching, he was just an old rancher dealing with a minor structural problem. But at night, after the sun went down and darkness covered the high desert, he went back into the tunnel. He'd reinforced the opening, building a proper hatch that could be secured from above. It was well hidden under a stack of hay bales and old equipment, invisible unless you knew where to look. Each night, he'd move the hay, open the hatch, and descend into the earth with his grandfather's lantern lighting the way. He was methodical in his exploration, documenting everything. He took photographs with an old Polaroid camera he'd found in Sarah's things. She'd used it for years to document her garden. The instant pictures weren't perfect, but they showed the tunnel's dimensions, the professional timber work, the tool marks in the walls. Evidence that would be harder for Thorne to explain away. On the third night, Caleb ventured all the way to the barrier at the tunnel's end. He'd brought tools this time, a pry bar and a small saw. Working carefully, quietly, he removed one of the boards that made up the barrier, creating a gap just wide enough to see through. Beyond the barrier was exactly what he'd suspected, a larger excavation, a proper mining operation carved into the earth. The space was lit by electric work lights, powered by a generator he could hear humming somewhere in the darkness. Rails had been laid for ore carts, and he could see piles of excavated rock stacked against one wall. But more importantly, he could see the vein they were working, a thick band of greenish-blue copper ore running through the rock face, rich and unmistakable. His copper, being stolen from beneath his land. He watched for nearly an hour, hidden in the darkness of the tunnel, observing the operation. There were 3 men working the night shift, using pneumatic drills to break up the ore, loading it into carts. They worked efficiently, professionally, like men who knew exactly what they were doing. One of them was Reed, Thorne's foreman. Caleb recognized his voice even before he saw his face, that distinctive gravelly tone that came from too many years of cigarettes and hard living. Reed directed the other two men, pointing out where to drill next, checking the quality of the ore as it came out of the wall. Caleb needed a sample, something he could have analyzed, something that would prove the copper came from his land and not Thorne's. He waited until the men took a break, gathering near the generator to share a thermos of coffee. Then, moving as quietly as his old bones would allow, he reached through the gap in the barrier and grabbed a fist-sized chunk of ore from a nearby pile. The rock was heavy, dense with metal. Even in the dim light, he could see the characteristic blue-green color of copper carbonate. This was high-grade ore, the kind that would fetch a good price at any smelter. No wonder Thorne had been so eager to buy his land. He was backing away from the barrier when he heard footsteps approaching. Caleb froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the gap, he could see Reed walking toward the barrier, a flashlight in his hand. Had he heard something? Seen movement in the darkness? "Did you hear that?" Reed's voice, closer now. "Hear what?" One of the other men, sounding bored. "Thought I heard something from the old access tunnel, probably just rats. But I better check it." Caleb didn't wait to hear more. He extinguished his lantern and moved as fast as he dared in the complete darkness, one hand on the tunnel wall to guide him, the other clutching the ore sample. Behind him, he could hear the scrape of wood as Reed began removing boards from the barrier. The tunnel seemed longer in darkness, endless. His foot caught on something, a timber support, and he nearly went down. He caught himself, kept moving, his breath coming in short gasps. He was too old for this. His body was screaming at him to slow down, to rest, but he couldn't stop. Not with Reed behind him, flashlight beam now visible in the tunnel, sweeping the walls. What the hell? Reed had seen the gap in the barrier, the fresh saw marks on the wood. He was in the tunnel now, moving fast, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. Caleb ran. There was no other word for it. His 67-year-old body protested every step, his lungs burning, his legs threatening to give out, but fear pushed him forward. He could see the faint rectangle of light ahead, the hatch, opening into his barn. Safety. He reached the timber ladder and climbed, his hands shaking so badly he nearly lost his grip. He hauled himself through the hatch, rolled to the side, and dropped the heavy wooden cover back into place. For good measure, he threw the locking bar across it, then dragged a hay bale on top. Below, he could hear Reed pounding on the hatch, shouting, but the cover was solid oak, 3 inches thick, and the lock would hold. At least for now. Caleb sat on the barn floor, gasping for breath, his heart doing things that made him wonder if this was how it would end, not from Thorne's greed, but from a heart attack in his own barn. Rusty was there instantly, whining and licking his face, sensing his distress. "I'm all right, boy," Caleb wheezed, though he wasn't sure that was true. "I'm all right." The pounding continued for another minute, then stopped. Reed's voice came through the wood, muffled but clear enough. "I don't know who's up there, but Mr. Thorne is going to hear about this. You can count on that." Footsteps retreated. Silence. Caleb stayed where he was for a long time, waiting for his heart rate to return to something approaching normal. When he finally trusted his legs to hold him, he stood and examined what he'd risked his life for, a chunk of blue-green ore about the size of a baseball, flecked with darker minerals and streaks of pure copper. It was beautiful in its way, and it was proof of the copper under his land, proof of what Thorne was stealing. Combined with the photographs and his map, it might be enough. It had to be enough. He wrapped the ore in an old cloth and hid it in the house, in the safe where Sarah had kept her jewelry. Then he sat at the kitchen table and waited for dawn, knowing that everything had just changed. Reed had seen the breach. By morning, Thorne would know that someone had discovered the tunnel. The careful game of gathering evidence in secret was over. Now it would become a race, Caleb trying to build his case before Thorne could destroy the evidence and create a story that would stand up in court. Caleb looked at his father's pocket watch, checking the time out of habit. 3:47 in the morning. In a few hours, he'd call Tom, tell him what happened, show him the ore sample. They'd have to move fast now. He thought about his grandfather, working these same hills over a century ago, never knowing that the greatest copper deposit of all lay beneath his homestead. He thought about his father, who'd worked this land his whole life and died without ever knowing what was buried under his feet. And he thought about Sarah, who'd stood by him through 42 years of struggle, never complaining, always believing that hard work and integrity would see them through. "I won't let them take it," he whispered to her photograph on the mantel. "I promise you that." Outside, the first grey light of dawn was beginning to show on the eastern horizon. Caleb had survived the night, but the real fight was just beginning, and this time he wouldn't be fighting alone. Tom Brennan arrived at the ranch before sunrise, his patrol car kicking up dust on the long dirt road. Caleb had called him at 4 in the morning, and to the sheriff's credit, he hadn't asked questions over the phone, just said he'd be there within the hour. Now they sat at Caleb's kitchen table, the chunk of copper ore between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Caleb walked him through the previous night's events, watching Tom's expression grow darker with each detail. "You could have been trapped down there," Tom said when Caleb finished. "Or worse if Reed had caught you, but he didn't. And now we have this." Caleb tapped the ore sample, physical evidence, proof of what they're doing. Tom picked up the rock, turning it over in his hands. The morning light coming through the window made the copper veins gleam. "It's definitely copper ore, high grade by the look of it. But proving it came from under your land and not Thorne's, that's going to be the trick. The tunnel proves it. The tunnel starts in his cellar and runs straight west, under my property. That's trespassing at minimum. If we can prove the tunnel exists and prove where it goes. Right now, all we have is your word and some Polaroids taken in the dark." Tom set the ore down carefully. "Don't get me wrong, Caleb. I believe you. But belief isn't evidence that will stand up in court. We need..." A vehicle approached on the road, moving fast. Both men turned to look out the window as a black Mercedes pulled up in front of the house. The driver's door opened, and Marcus Thorne himself stepped out. Caleb had seen Thorne around town. Of course, hard to miss a man like that in a community as small as Copper Ridge, but they'd never spoken face to face. Thorne was in his mid-50s, tall and well-dressed, even this early in the morning. Everything about him screamed money and confidence, from his tailored suit to his polished shoes that had no business being on a working ranch. "Speak of the devil," Tom muttered, standing. "Let me handle this." They met Thorne on the porch. The man's smile was perfectly practiced, the kind of expression that never reached his eyes. "Sheriff Brennan, Mr. Hayes. I hope I'm not intruding at this early hour." "That depends on why you're here," Tom said, his voice professionally neutral. "I'll get straight to the point. My foreman reported an incident last night. Someone broke into one of my storage facilities, an underground structure on my property. I wanted to check with my neighbors, see if anyone saw or heard anything suspicious." The lie was delivered so smoothly, so confidently, that Caleb almost doubted his own memory of what had happened. But there it was, Thorne already building his narrative, establishing that the tunnel was on his property, that Caleb had been the trespasser. "Didn't hear anything," Caleb said, keeping his voice steady. "Been right here all night." Thorne's eyes shifted to him, assessing. "I see. Well, if you do remember anything, any unusual sounds, perhaps from your barn area, I'd appreciate a call. This is a secure facility, and the breach is quite concerning." "What kind of storage?" Tom asked. "Anything valuable taken?" "Geological samples, mostly. I've been conducting mineral surveys on my land. Nothing that would interest a common thief, but the principle of the thing. You understand." He turned back to Caleb. "I couldn't help but notice, Mr. Hayes, that you've been doing some work on your barn. Structural repairs?" The question was casual, but Caleb heard the threat beneath it. Thorne knew, maybe not everything, but enough. "Foundation issue, nothing major." "I'm glad to hear it. Old buildings can be dangerous when the ground beneath them becomes unstable." "I'd hate to see you get hurt." The smile never wavered, but the message was clear. Stay away from the tunnel, or there would be consequences. Tom stepped forward, inserting himself between the two men. "Mr. Thorne, if you're reporting a break-in, you should file a formal complaint. I can take your statement." "That won't be necessary. I'm handling it internally. I just wanted to be a good neighbor and give Mr. Dupers Hayes a heads up in case he saw anything." Thorne pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Caleb. "My direct line. Day or night. And Mr. Hayes, my offer still stands. If you ever decide to sell, I'm prepared to be very generous." He walked back to his Mercedes, moving with the casual confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. The car pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the morning air. "That son of a—" Caleb started, but Tom held up a hand. "Inside, now." Back in the kitchen, Tom paced like a caged animal. "He's getting ahead of the story. If you try to claim you found a tunnel under your barn, he'll say it was his facility, that you broke into it. Your word against his. And he's got resources to make his version stick. So what do? We move faster than I wanted to." Tom pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Judge Morrison, getting that warrant. We search Thorne's property today. Document everything before he has a chance to clean it up or fill in the tunnel." "Will Morrison grant it?" "Thorne's got connections. Morrison's old school. Doesn't care how much money you have if you're breaking the law. I'll have the warrant by noon." But Tom's phone rang before he could make the call. He answered, listened for a moment, then his expression went cold. "I'll be right there." He ended the call and looked at Caleb. "That was my deputy. There's been a complaint filed against you. Anonymous tip about illegal excavation on your property, possible damage to neighboring land. The county building inspector is on his way here now." Caleb felt the ground shifting beneath him. "Thorne. Has to be. He's trying to tie you up in bureaucracy, make it look like you're the one doing something wrong." Tom headed for the door. "I've got to go deal with this. In the meantime, don't let anyone on your property without a warrant, and don't, I repeat, do not go back in that tunnel. That's evidence now, and if you contaminate it, any case we build could fall apart." After Tom left, Caleb stood alone in his kitchen, feeling the walls closing in. Thorne had moved fast, faster than he'd expected. The man had resources, connections, and a team of people whose job was to make problems disappear. What did Caleb have? A chunk of ore, some Polaroids, and a map drawn in pencil. An hour later, the building inspector arrived, a nervous young man named Patterson, who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. He examined the barn, took photographs, asked questions about the structural repairs. Caleb answered honestly, showing him the reinforced hatch, explaining that he'd discovered a subsidence issue and dealt with it. Patterson seemed satisfied, but as he was leaving, he handed Caleb an envelope. "This was in my truck. Someone must have left it there while I was inspecting." Inside was a letter on expensive letterhead, Thorne Development Corporation, with a law firm's name beneath it. Caleb read it twice, his anger building with each word. The letter claimed that excavation work on Caleb's property had caused structural damage to Thorne's underground facilities. It demanded immediate cessation of all digging, compensation for damages, and this was the real knife suggested that Caleb's financial difficulties had driven him to desperate measures, including possible theft of mineral samples from Thorne's survey operations. Everything was turned upside down. Thorne was painting himself as the victim, Caleb as the desperate thief. And with his foreclosure pending and his debt public knowledge, who would the courts believe? The wealthy developer with lawyers and documentation, or the broke rancher with nothing but his word? Caleb sat down heavily at his kitchen table, the letter in his hands. His father's watch pressed against his chest, its familiar weight a reminder of everything at stake. May you always have time to do what's right. But what was right when the system itself seemed designed to protect men like Thorne? What was right when every move you made could be twisted and used against you? He thought about giving up. It would be easy to take Thorne's offer, sell the land, walk away with enough to settle his debts, and live out his remaining years in peace. Sarah was gone. He had no children to pass the land to. Maybe it was time to admit that some fights couldn't be won. But then he thought about his grandfather, homesteading this land when it was nothing but rock and hope. He thought about his father, working it through droughts and depressions. He thought about Sarah, buried on the ridge overlooking the valley she'd loved. This was Hayes' land, and he'd be damned if he'd let Thorne steal it through legal tricks and intimidation. There had to be a way to prove what Thorne was doing. There had to be evidence that couldn't be twisted or explained away. He just had to find it before Thorne's lawyers buried him in paper and his time ran out. Tom returned that afternoon with news, both good and bad. The bad news was that Thorne's lawyers had already filed for an emergency injunction, and the judge had agreed to hear arguments the following morning before allowing the search to proceed. "It's a delay tactic," Tom explained, sitting once again at Caleb's kitchen table. "They're buying time to clean up whatever evidence might exist, but it also means they're worried. If they had nothing to hide, they'd welcome the search. By tomorrow, they could fill in the tunnel, move the equipment, destroy everything. That's the idea. But here's the thing. Even if they do, there will be evidence of recent excavation, disturbed earth, compaction patterns, traces of copper ore in the soil. I've got a forensic geologist on standby, a friend from my army days who does consulting work. If there's been mining activity on your property, he'll be able to prove it." It was something, at least. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were always one step behind, always reacting to Thorne's moves instead of making their own. "There's something else," Tom said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "I spent the morning at the county recorder's office, going through old survey maps and land records. Found something interesting." He spread a yellowed map across the table, a survey from 1923, showing property lines and geological features. Someone had marked it up with handwritten notes and X marks in several locations. "This was done by the Montana Bureau of Mines," Tom explained. "Back when copper mining was big business in these parts, they surveyed all the major deposits, mapped the veins." His finger traced a line on the map. "Look here. This notation says, 'Significant copper deposit, unexploited, extends approximately quarter-mile east to west.'" Caleb leaned closer, studying the map. The property boundaries were different then. The land had been subdivided several times over the decades, but he recognized the landmarks. The creek bed, the ridgeline, the distinctive rock formation locals called Devil's Thumb. "That's my land," he said quietly. "They knew there was copper here almost 100 years ago." "They knew, but your grandfather was a rancher, not a miner. He probably never saw this survey, never knew what he was sitting on. The copper boom ended before he could have exploited it anyway, and by the time metal prices went up again," Tom shrugged. "History had moved on. Until now. Until Thorne found this map." "Exactly. I'm guessing he did his research before buying his property, found these old surveys, and realized your land was the key to accessing a major copper deposit. He couldn't mine it directly, that would require your permission and your mineral rights. So he did the next best thing. He went under." Caleb stared at the map, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on him. His grandfather had walked this land, never knowing fortune lay beneath his feet. His father had struggled to make ends meet while sitting on what could have been generational wealth. And now, when it might finally matter, when it might save the family homestead, Thorne was trying to steal it all. "Can we use this?" he asked. "The survey, I mean. Does it prove anything?" "It establishes that the copper deposit is primarily under your land, not Thorne's. Combined with the tunnel evidence and the ore sample, it builds a strong case that he was deliberately targeting your mineral rights." But Tom held up a hand before Caleb could get too hopeful. "We still need to prove the tunnel exists and that mining operations were conducted from it. That's where tomorrow's hearing becomes crucial." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning strategy, going over every piece of evidence they had, anticipating arguments Thorne's lawyers might make. By the time Tom left, the sun was setting, and Caleb's head was spinning with legal terminology and procedural details. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about that survey map, about his grandfather working this land while copper worth millions sat unexploited beneath his feet. Had the old man ever suspected? Had there been signs he'd missed or dismissed? Caleb remembered stories his father used to tell about how Grandfather Hayes had been convinced there was something special about this land, something that made it worth fighting for, even when the droughts came and the cattle died. Everyone had thought he was stubborn or foolish, but maybe he'd known something. Maybe some instinct had told him this ground held secrets worth keeping. Around midnight, Caleb gave up on sleep and went out to the barn. He stood over the covered hatch, listening. He could hear faint sounds from below machinery, voices, the unmistakable noise of men working underground. Thorne's crew was down there right now, probably doing exactly what Tom had predicted. Cleaning up, moving equipment, trying to erase evidence before tomorrow's hearing. Every instinct told him to throw open the hatch, to climb down there with a camera and document everything before it disappeared. But Tom's warning echoed in his mind: don't contaminate the evidence. One wrong move, one thing that could be construed as trespassing or tampering, and Thorne's lawyers would use it to invalidate everything they'd found. So Caleb just stood there, listening to his fortune being stolen beneath his feet, unable to do anything about it. Rusty pressed against his leg, whining softly. The old dog had stayed close these past few days, sensing his distress. Caleb reached down and scratched behind the healer's ears. "I know, boy, I know." He looked around the barn at the tools worn smooth by 3 generations of use, at the timber beams his grandfather had hewn by hand, at the decades of accumulated history that filled every corner. This place matters, not because of the copper, not because of the money. It matters because it's ours, because good men built it and better men kept it going. He thought about Sarah, about how she'd loved this place despite its hardships. She used to say that land had memory, that if you listened close enough you could hear the stories of everyone who'd ever worked it. He'd thought it was just her poetic way of looking at things, but standing here now, he understood. This barn, this land, it held the sweat and hope of everyone who'd come before. To lose it would be to lose all of that. The sounds from below continued the theft, proceeding even as he stood helpless above it. "Not much longer," he whispered to the darkness. "Tomorrow we prove what you're doing. Tomorrow this ends." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. Thorne had money, lawyers, connections. What did Caleb have? An old survey map, a chunk of ore, and the testimony of a desperate man facing foreclosure. In the cold mathematics of the legal system, was that enough? He stayed in the barn until dawn, keeping vigil over his stolen fortune, his father's watch ticking steadily in his pocket. The inscription ran through his mind like a prayer: "May you always have time to do what's right." Time was what he needed most, and had the least of. Tomorrow's hearing would determine everything. Tomorrow would show whether justice still meant something, or if men like Thorne had finally figured out how to buy it outright. As the sun rose, Caleb made himself a promise. Whatever happened in that courtroom, whatever tricks Thorne's lawyers pulled, he would not give up. He would fight for this land with everything he had, right up until the moment they physically removed him from it. Because some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. The hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning at the county courthouse. Caleb put on his only suit, the same one he'd worn to Sarah's funeral, and drove to town with Tom, following in his patrol car. The courthouse was a stone building that had stood since territorial days, its walls thick enough to keep out the summer heat and winter cold. Thorne's legal team was already there, 3 lawyers in expensive suits, armed with briefcases and an air of supreme confidence. Thorne himself sat behind them, looking relaxed and unworried. When Caleb entered, Thorne gave him that same practiced smile, the one that said he'd already won, and this was just a formality. Judge Morrison was 73 years old, a former prosecutor who'd been on the bench for 30 years. He looked at the assembled lawyers with the weary expression of a man who'd seen every trick in the book and invented a few himself. "Gentlemen," he said, "let's keep this brief. Sheriff Brennan has requested a warrant to search property owned by Mr. Thorne. Mr. Thorne's counsel has filed for an injunction. Make your arguments." Thorne's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Garrison, stood up. "Your Honor, this warrant is based entirely on the uncorroborated claims of Mr. Hayes, a man currently facing foreclosure and significant financial distress. There is no credible evidence of any wrongdoing, merely the desperate accusations of someone looking for any way to avoid his legitimate debts. We believe this is a harassment suit designed to—" "Judge," Tom interrupted, standing, "if I may. The warrant is based on physical evidence, a tunnel discovered on Mr. Hayes's property, photographs documenting said tunnel, and geological samples suggesting illegal mining operations. This isn't harassment. This is a legitimate criminal investigation." "Alleged tunnel," Garrison corrected smoothly, "which, if it exists at all, is likely an old mining shaft predating both properties. My client has been conducting legitimate mineral surveys on his own land, all properly permitted and documented. Mr. Hayes' claims are nothing more than—" The courtroom door opened, cutting off Garrison mid-sentence. A woman entered mid-40s, businesslike, carrying a leather folder. She walked straight to Tom and handed him the folder, whispering something Caleb couldn't hear. Tom's expression changed as he opened the folder. His eyes widened, then narrowed with an anger Caleb had rarely seen in his old friend. He looked at Thorne, and something passed between them, recognition, challenge. "Your Honor," Tom said, his voice carefully controlled, "I'd like to submit new evidence that's just come to light. Evidence that significantly alters the nature of this case." Garrison objected immediately, but Morrison waved him down. "Let me see what you have, Sheriff." Tom approached the bench and handed over the folder. The judge read in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he looked at Thorne with something approaching disgust. "Mr. Thorne," Morrison said slowly, "would you care to explain these documents?" For the first time, Thorne's confident facade cracked. Just for a moment, but Caleb saw it, a flash of genuine concern crossing his face before the mask returned. "I have no idea what you're referring to, Your Honor. I haven't seen—" "These are medical billing records from County General Hospital," Morrison interrupted. "Specifically, records related to the treatment of Sarah Hayes, Mr. Caleb Hayes' late wife. According to these documents, Mrs. Hayes received treatment for lung cancer 3 years ago. The total cost of treatment was over $300,000. Caleb's breath caught. He remembered those bills, remembered watching them pile up like mountains of debt while Sarah grew weaker. The treatment had failed, she died anyway, and the debt had consumed everything they'd saved, everything they'd built together. "What you may not know, Mr. Thorne," the judge continued, his voice cold, "is that Mrs. Hayes' cancer was caused by prolonged exposure to arsenic. Arsenic that leached into their well water from," he consulted the document again, "from tailings deliberately dumped on adjacent property. Property that, at the time, was owned by a subsidiary of your company." The courtroom went silent. Caleb felt the floor tilt beneath him. Arsenic, dumping, Thorne's company. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, "these documents include internal emails and reports showing that your company was aware of the contamination and chose not to report it, chose not to warn neighboring property owners. And most damningly, they show that you personally signed off on the decision to cover up the dumping rather than pay for proper remediation." Thorne stood up, his composure slipping. "Your Honor, I don't know where these documents came from, but they came from a whistleblower in your organization," Tom said. "Someone with a conscience, apparently, someone who was there this morning because they read about your lawsuit against Mr. Hayes and decided enough was enough." Caleb's mind was reeling. Sarah's cancer hadn't been random bad luck. It had been caused by Thorne's negligence, Thorne's greed. The medical debt that had destroyed them financially, that had put him on the path to foreclosure, all of it traced back to the man sitting across the courtroom. "You killed her," Caleb heard himself say. His voice sounded strange, distant. Garrison tried to object, to say something about unproven allegations, but Morrison silenced him with a look. "Sheriff Brennan," the judge said, "not only am I granting your warrant, I'm authorizing you to bring criminal charges against Mr. Thorne for illegal disposal of hazardous materials, contamination of water supplies," and he looked at the documents again, "conspiracy to conceal environmental crimes. And I'm referring these medical records to the district attorney for review regarding potential wrongful death charges." The room erupted. Garrison and his team surrounded Thorne, talking urgently. Tom was at Caleb's side, steady and solid. "I didn't know," Tom said quietly. "I swear I didn't know about Sarah. This woman, her name is Patricia Reed. She's been Thorne's office manager for 8 years. She brought these documents to me this morning. Said she couldn't live with it anymore." Patricia Reed. Related to the foreman Caleb had encountered in the tunnel, it didn't matter now. What mattered was that the truth was finally coming out. But beneath the shock and the revelation, Caleb felt something else crystallizing. Thorne hadn't just been stealing his copper. The whole thing had been deliberate from the start. Contaminate the land, cause financial distress, then swoop in and buy the property cheap. And when Caleb refused to sell, Thorne had simply decided to take what he wanted anyway, using the tunnel to steal the copper, while Caleb was too financially desperate to notice or fight back. It was all connected. Sarah's death, the medical debt, the foreclosure, the tunnel, all of it part of the same pattern of greed and indifference to human cost. "Your Honor," Caleb said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice, "I'd like to add a claim for damages, not just for the copper theft, for everything, for my wife's medical costs, for her death, for 3 years of thinking it was just bad luck when it was deliberate poisoning." Morrison nodded slowly. "File your claim, Mr. Hayes. I suspect you'll have plenty of grounds." He turned to Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, I'm ordering you to preserve all records related to your mining operations, including any and all excavations on or under properties adjacent to yours. Any attempt to destroy evidence will result in immediate contempt charges and arrest. Do you understand?" Thorne's mask had completely shattered now. He looked older, diminished. "Yes, Your Honor." "Sheriff, execute your warrant. Take whoever you need with you. If there's a tunnel under Mr. Hayes' barn leading to Mr. Thorne's property, I want it documented, measured and photographed from every angle." Morrison banged his gavel. "We're adjourned. Mr. Thorne, don't leave town. I suspect the district attorney will want to speak with you very soon." As the courtroom emptied, Caleb stood rooted to the spot. Tom's hand on his shoulder was the only thing keeping him grounded. "I'm sorry," Tom said. "I'm so sorry about Sarah." "He killed her," Caleb said again, still trying to process it. "All this time I thought it was just one of those things, bad luck. But he killed her, and then he tried to take everything else too." "We'll make this right," Tom promised. "I swear to you, we'll make this right." Outside the courthouse, Patricia Reed was waiting. She was a thin woman with tired eyes and hands that trembled as she lit a cigarette. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I'm sorry I didn't come forward sooner. I didn't know about your wife until recently. When I found those records and realized what the dumping had done, I couldn't." Her voice broke. "My brother works for Mr. Thorne. That's why I stayed quiet for so long. But some things are more important than family loyalty." "Thank you," Caleb managed. "Thank you for having the courage to tell the truth." She nodded, blinking back tears. "There's more in those files than just the dumping. There's documentation of the tunnel, the mining operation, how much copper they've extracted. Everything you need to prove what he did." As she walked away, Caleb looked up at the courthouse, at the stone walls that had witnessed 100 years of justice and injustice. Today, at least, the scales had tipped in the right direction. But justice for Sarah, justice for what Thorne had taken from them that was just beginning. The real fight was still ahead. The search of Thorne's property began that afternoon. Tom assembled a team, 2 deputies, the forensic geologist he'd mentioned, a county surveyor, and a photographer who specialized in documenting crime scenes. Caleb rode with Tom, Rusty sitting in the back seat, refusing to be left behind. Thorne's estate looked different now that Caleb understood what lay beneath it. The manicured lawns and expensive architecture seemed like a stage set built to hide something rotten underneath. Security guards stood at the gates, but they stepped aside when Tom presented the warrant. Whatever fight Thorne had left in him, he'd decided not to waste it on this. The mansion's cellar was accessed through the kitchen, a modern steel door that looked more appropriate for a bank vault than a wine cellar. One of Thorne's security men unlocked it, his face carefully neutral, and stepped aside. The stairs led down into a space that had been expanded far beyond any normal basement. Industrial lighting illuminated a vast underground chamber, easily 50 feet across. And there, in the far corner, partially concealed behind stacked equipment, was the entrance to the tunnel. "Get pictures of everything," Tom ordered. "I want documentation that could convince a blind jury." The photographer went to work, his camera flashing as he captured every angle. The forensic geologist, a weathered man named Dr. Carson, examined the tunnel entrance with professional interest. "This is recent work," he said, running his hand along the timber supports. 3 to 6 months old, I'd estimate. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. These supports are professional grade, properly installed. This isn't amateur hour. They made their way into the tunnel, single file, the photographer documenting every foot. Caleb had been down here before, of course, but seeing it with lights and witnesses made it real in a way his midnight excursions hadn't. This wasn't just a story he was telling, this was physical evidence that even Thorne's lawyers couldn't explain away. The tunnel ran straight and true, exactly as Caleb remembered. At intervals, they found equipment, pneumatic drills, ore carts on rails, safety equipment, and most damning of all, piles of extracted copper ore waiting to be transported. Dr. Carson took samples at multiple points along the tunnel's length. "I'll need to run lab tests to be completely certain," he said, "but I can tell you right now that this ore is consistent with the deposits shown in that 1923 survey. The mineral composition, the color, the matrix, this all matches the geological profile of the Hayes property deposit." At the 300-yard mark, they reached the collapse section where Caleb had broken through. The photographer took dozens of pictures, the disturbed earth, the saw marks on the timbers where Caleb had removed a board, the footprints in the dust showing traffic from both directions. "This is where I fell through," Caleb explained to Tom. "I was trying to clear away what I thought was a groundhog nest. The floor gave way, and I dropped straight down into the tunnel. The surveyor, a methodical woman named Chen, was taking measurements with a laser device. 'We're definitely under the Hayes property now,' she confirmed. According to property records, the boundary line is about 50 yards back. This tunnel extends roughly 250 yards into Hayes land." Tom looked at Caleb. 250 yards of illegal excavation. That's not a mistake or an accident. That's deliberate theft. They continued to the end of the tunnel, to the expanded chamber where the real mining had taken place. The copper vein was clearly visible in the rock face, a thick band of greenish-blue ore shot through with veins of pure metal. Work lights illuminated a professional mining operation, reinforced chambers, proper ventilation shafts, evidence of systematic extraction. "My God," Dr. Carson breathed, "this is a significant deposit. Based on what I'm seeing, I'd estimate they've extracted at least 20 tons of high-grade ore from this location. Current market prices," he did quick mental math, "that's somewhere in the neighborhood of $400,000. And there's easily that much again still in the ground. $400,000, more than enough to save Caleb's ranch, pay off his debts, and live comfortably for the rest of his life. all of it stolen while he slept in the house above, grieving his wife and trying to figure out how to survive. The photographer captured everything: the vein itself, the mining equipment, the piles of extracted ore, the sophisticated ventilation system. Each flash of the camera felt like another nail in Thorne's coffin. "I want samples from multiple points," Tom instructed Dr. Carson. "I want to be able to prove beyond any doubt that this ore came from under Caleb's land and not from Thorne's property." "Won't be a problem," Carson said. "Each geological deposit has a unique signature: trace minerals, crystal structure, oxidation patterns. It's like a fingerprint. I'll be able to match these samples to the deposit location with certainty." As they worked, Caleb found himself thinking about his grandfather again. The old man had walked above this copper vein every day of his adult life, never suspecting what lay beneath his feet. He died thinking he was leaving his son a hard-scrabble ranch that would take everything and give back just enough to survive. But he'd actually been leaving a fortune, one that had waited a century to be discovered, and now that it had been discovered, Thorne had tried to steal it. The anger that had been simmering since the courthouse hearing flared hotter. This wasn't just about money or property anymore. This was about a pattern of destruction that had taken Sarah's life, nearly taken Caleb's home, and would have succeeded if not for a persistent dirt mound and an observant dog. They spent 3 hours documenting the tunnel and mining operation. By the time they emerged back into Thorne's cellar, they had over 200 photographs, dozens of ore samples, and measurements precise enough to map every foot of the tunnel's length. Back at the ranch, Tom spread the photographs across Caleb's kitchen table. The evidence was overwhelming, a visual record of systematic theft that no jury could ignore. "This is enough," Tom said with satisfaction. "Between these photos, Doctor, Carson's geological analysis, the surveyor's measurements, and the documents Patricia Reed provided, we've got Thorne dead to rights. His lawyers can spin whatever story they want, but facts are facts." "What happens now?" Caleb asked. "Now I file charges: criminal trespass, theft, illegal mining operations. The district attorney will add the environmental crimes and start building the wrongful death case. And you," Tom pointed at Caleb, "you file a civil suit for damages. Everything Thorne stole, plus compensation for Sarah's medical costs and her death. The way I see it, Thorne's going to spend the next decade in court, and when it's all over, he'll be lucky if he has 2 nickels to rub together." It should have felt like victory, but Caleb found himself thinking about Sarah, about how she'd suffered through months of treatment, never knowing that her cancer had been caused by someone else's greed. She'd died thinking it was just bad luck, random cellular malfunction. She'd never known there was someone to blame, someone who could have prevented it. "She should have known," Caleb said quietly. "She should have known it wasn't just random, that there was a reason." Tom's expression softened. "Maybe it's better she didn't. Anger and blame, they're heavy burdens to carry in your final days. She got to spend that time focused on what mattered: you, the ranch, the life you'd built together. Maybe that was a mercy. Maybe. But it felt like one more thing. Thorne had stolen Sarah's right to know the truth, her right to be angry at the man who'd poisoned her. That evening, after Tom left, Caleb sat on his porch watching the sunset. Rusty lay at his feet, content now that his human was home and safe. The desert stretched out before them, painted in shades of orange and purple, beautiful and harsh and unforgiving. His father's watch pressed against his chest, its familiar weight a reminder of continuity. 3 generations of Hayes men had stood on this porch and watched this same sunset. His grandfather had stood here dreaming of the ranch he would build. His father had stood here planning the work of tomorrow. And now Caleb stood here, holding evidence that would bring down the man who'd tried to destroy everything they'd built. He pulled out the watch, reading the inscription in the fading light. "May you always have time to do what's right." "I'm trying, Pop," he whispered. "I'm doing what's right. But it's hard. It's so damned hard." The watch ticked on, steady and reliable, measuring out the seconds of his life one at a time. Tomorrow he'd meet with lawyers, start the process of filing his civil suit. The day after that, he'd begin the work of securing his mine, his copper mine, and figuring out how to extract the fortune that lay beneath his land legally and safely. But tonight, he just sat and remembered. He remembered Sarah's laugh, the way she'd sing while working in her garden, the feel of her hand in his during 42 years of marriage. He remembered his father teaching him to mend fence, his grandfather's stories about the early days when this had all been raw frontier. And he remembered the moment, just a week ago, when he'd swept away that first pile of mysterious dirt, annoyed at what he thought was a simple pest problem. If he'd known then what that dirt would lead to, the tunnel, the copper, the revelations about Sarah's death, would he have still swept it away? Or would he have covered it back up and returned to his quiet desperation, to his slow slide toward foreclosure and the end of everything his family had built? No, he would have done exactly what he did, because avoiding the truth never made it less true. It just made you blind to it. The last light faded from the sky, stars emerging like silver punctures in black fabric. Tomorrow the real work would begin, the legal battles, the mining operations, the rebuilding of everything Thorne had tried to destroy. But tonight, Caleb Hayes sat on his porch, his dog at his feet and his father's watch in his hand, and allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice still meant something in this world. The dirt mound in his barn had been annoying, mysterious, persistent, but it had also been providence, revealing truths that needed revealing, setting in motion events that would finally bring Thorne's house of cards tumbling down. Sometimes, Caleb thought, the smallest things lead to the biggest changes. Sometimes a pile of dirt is all it takes to uncover buried truths and hidden fortunes. Sometimes justice needs a little help, a lucky break, a persistent dog, a whistleblower with a conscience. He stood, bones creaking, and headed inside. Tomorrow would be a long day, but for the first time in 3 years, he was actually looking forward to it. The district attorney moved fast. Within a week, formal charges had been filed: criminal trespass, theft of mineral resources, illegal mining operations, unlawful disposal of hazardous materials, and conspiracy to conceal environmental crimes. The wrongful death case would take longer to build, but the mining theft was straightforward enough to prosecute immediately. Thorne's arraignment was set for a Thursday morning. Caleb sat in the courtroom's public gallery, watching as the man who'd killed his wife and stolen his fortune stood before Judge Morrison in handcuffs. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit. The confident smile had vanished entirely, leaving behind a hollow-eyed man who looked older than his years. "How do you plead?" Morrison asked. Thorne's lawyer, a new one, since Garrison had apparently decided this case was too toxic to touch, started to speak, but Thorne cut him off. "Guilty," he said. His voice was flat, defeated. "I plead guilty to all charges." A murmur went through the courtroom. Even the district attorney looked surprised. Plea deals usually took months of negotiation, but Thorne was apparently done fighting. Morrison raised an eyebrow. "You understand what you're saying, Mr. Thorne? You're confessing to multiple felonies, each carrying significant prison time." "I understand, Your Honor. I'm guilty. I did everything they're accusing me of, and worse. I don't want a trial. I just want—" His voice cracked. "I just want it to be over." The DA stood. "Your Honor, the state requests immediate remand. Mr. Thorne is a flight risk with substantial assets." "Granted," Morrison said. "Mr. Thorne, you'll remain in custody until sentencing. I'm ordering a full financial audit of your assets and business holdings. Any funds derived from illegal activities will be seized and used to compensate your victims, starting with Mr. Hayes. Sentencing is set for 6 weeks from today." As they led Thorne away, he looked directly at Caleb for the first time. There was no defiance in his eyes, no anger, just an empty exhaustion that made him look already imprisoned by something worse than bars. After the hearing, Caleb met with his own lawyer, a sharp young woman named Andrea Santos, who'd taken his case pro bono after reading about it in the newspaper. "That was unexpected," she said, spreading papers on the conference room table. "With a guilty plea, the civil case becomes much simpler. We don't have to prove what happened. Thorne just admitted it in open court. Now, it's just a matter of calculating damages." She showed him a preliminary assessment. The stolen copper, $400,000, plus an estimated $200,000 still in the ground. Sarah's medical expenses, $312,000. Pain and suffering, loss of consortium, punitive damages. The numbers climbed higher with each category. "Conservatively," Santos said, "you're looking at somewhere between $2 and $3 million in total damages. Thorne's assets are being audited now, but from what we can see, he's worth somewhere around $8 million, not including his property holdings. $2 million. It was an abstract number, impossible to really comprehend. Caleb had spent his whole life counting pennies, worrying about whether he could afford new fence posts or veterinary care for his cattle. Now someone was telling him he was about to become a millionaire. But the money felt hollow. It wouldn't bring Sarah back. It wouldn't give him those 3 years he'd spent grieving and struggling, believing her death was just cruel fate. It wouldn't erase the memory of watching her waste away in that hospital bed, tubes and machines keeping her alive for a few more painful weeks. "What happens to Thorne?" he asked. "Prison. With the charges he pled guilty to, he's looking at 15 to 20 years minimum. At his age, he'll likely die behind bars." Santos paused. "I know it's not enough. Nothing can really be enough for what he did, but it's something." That afternoon, Caleb drove out to the ridge where Sarah was buried. The simple headstone bore her name, the dates of her birth and death, and the words she'd chosen herself. She loved this land and the man who worked it. He sat on the ground beside her grave, Rusty lying next to him with his head on Caleb's lap. "We got him," Caleb said quietly. "Thorne's going to prison, and the copper, Sarah, there's so much copper under our land. Enough to secure the ranch for generations. We were sitting on a fortune all along." The wind whispered through the sage, carrying the scent of desert flowers. "I wish you were here to see it. I wish you could know that your death wasn't random, that there was someone to hold accountable. I wish," his voice broke, "I wish a lot of things, but mostly I just wish you were here." He sat there until the sun began to set, watching light and shadow play across the land his family had held for 3 generations and would hold for 3 more. The land that had cost so much to keep, but was finally, truly theirs. In his pocket, his father's watch ticked steadily on, measuring out the time he had left, reminding him that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Justice had been slow in coming, but it had come. That had to be enough. "Rest easy," he whispered to Sarah's grave. "It's over now. You can rest easy." The financial audit took 3 weeks. When the results came in, they revealed that Thorne's crimes went deeper than anyone had suspected. The copper operation under Caleb's land wasn't his first theft, just his most recent. Over the past 5 years, Thorne had used similar tactics across 3 states, contaminating properties to drive down values, then buying them cheap and extracting minerals the owners never knew they had. The State Mining Commission revoked all of Thorne's permits and mineral rights. His properties were seized, his bank accounts frozen. By the time the lawyers finished dividing up his assets among his various victims, there was barely enough left to cover Caleb's claim, let alone everyone else Thorne had wronged. But Caleb's claim was first in line, given the direct connection to Sarah's death. Santos walked him through the settlement documents, pointing out each line item: stolen copper valued at $600,000, medical expenses, compensatory damages, punitive damages. The final number came to $2.4 million. "The bank has agreed to release the foreclosure," Santos explained. "Your debt is paid in full, with enough left over to live comfortably for the rest of your life, and you still own the land, including all mineral rights." She slid another document across the table. It was a certificate from the Montana Department of Natural Resources, officially registering Caleb as the owner of Mineral Claim 47B, covering the copper deposit beneath his property. "This makes it legal," she said. "You can mine it yourself, lease it to a mining company, or just leave it in the ground. The choice is yours, but no one can ever take it from you again." Caleb stared at the certificate, at his name printed in official black ink, Caleb Hayes, sole proprietor. After 3 generations of his family working this land without ever knowing what lay beneath it, the copper was finally, legally, his. "What would you do?" he asked Santos. "If it was your land, your copper?" She considered the question carefully. "I'd partner with a reputable mining company. Let them do the extraction. It's dangerous, expensive work. You take a percentage of the profits. They handle the operations and environmental compliance. You could structure it so the land stays yours, but you benefit from the copper without having to physically mine it yourself." It made sense. Caleb was 67 years old, in no shape to run a mining operation. But he could oversee it, make sure it was done right, ensure that this land his grandfather had homesteaded would continue to support his family or whoever he chose to leave it to for generations to come. Tom stopped by that evening, finding Caleb on his porch as usual. They shared a beer, something they hadn't done in months, and watched the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold. "Heard Thorne's sentencing is next week," Tom said. 18 years. That's what Santos thinks he'll get. He'll die in prison. "Yes." Caleb took a long drink. "I thought I'd feel different when this was all over. Triumphant, maybe, or at least satisfied. But I just feel tired." "You've been fighting for months. You're allowed to be tired." "It's not that kind of tired." Caleb struggled to find the words. "Sarah's still gone. Those 3 years of thinking I'd failed her somehow, that I couldn't protect her, I still lost that time, and Thorne going to prison doesn't change any of it." Tom was quiet for a moment. Justice isn't about making things right. Nothing can make things right after something like this. Justice is about acknowledgement, making sure the truth is known, making sure wrongs are answered for. You did that. You made sure Sarah's death meant something, that Thorne couldn't just walk away and do it to someone else, I suppose. And you saved the ranch. Your grandfather would be proud. Your father, too. That much was true. The Hayes land would continue, secured not just for now, but for the future. The copper beneath it meant financial security that 3 generations had never known. He could hire help, fix everything that had fallen into disrepair, maybe even expand the herd back to what it had been when Sarah was alive. "Patricia Reed stopped by yesterday," Caleb said. "Thorne's former office manager. She wanted to apologize again. She's the one who broke this whole thing open, without her courage." "I told her that." "Told her she had nothing to apologize for." Caleb set down his beer. "Her brother quit working for Thorne the day after the arraignment. She said he couldn't live with what they'd done, even though he didn't know about the dumping. Just the tunnel, the theft. Said his conscience wouldn't let him. Lot of consciences waking up lately. Better late than never, I suppose." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged. Rusty sprawled between them, content. This porch, this view, this moment, it was what Caleb had been fighting for all along. Not the money, not revenge, but the simple right to sit on his own land and watch the day end in peace. "What now?" Tom asked. Caleb pulled out his father's watch, checked the time more from habit than necessity. "Now I rebuild, fix up the ranch, get it running properly again. Maybe I'll find some young rancher who wants to learn the trade, someone to pass this all on to eventually." "Sounds like a good plan. And Tom," Caleb looked at his old friend, "thank you for believing me when you didn't have to, for fighting when it would have been easier to let it go." "That's what friends do," Tom said simply. "That's what's right. May you always have time to do what's right." The inscription seemed more relevant now than ever. Caleb had used his time well, had fought for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. And in the end, right had prevailed. Not perfectly, not completely, Sarah was still gone, and nothing would change that. But justice had been served, and the land was secure. It would have to be enough. 6 months later, Caleb stood in his barn watching workers install new support beams. The old structure was being reinforced, not torn down. He'd been adamant about that. His grandfather had built this barn with his own hands, and it would stand for another 100 years if Caleb had anything to say about it. The hatch that led to the tunnel had been permanently sealed. Tom had supervised the work personally, making sure it was done right. The tunnel itself had been filled in, the entrance on what used to be Thorne's property cemented over. The copper mine, Caleb's copper mine, now had a proper entrance on his own land, safely away from any structures, with professional equipment and trained workers operating under strict environmental oversight. He'd partnered with a mining company out of Butte, just as Santos had suggested. They handled the extraction. He collected 40% of the profits. The first check had arrived 2 weeks ago, $73,000, more money than he'd seen in his entire life from a single source, and that was just the first quarter of operations. The geologists estimated the vein would continue producing for at least 15 years, maybe longer. The ranch was transformed. New fences, repaired buildings, a herd of 200 cattle, more than his father had ever run. He'd hired 3 ranch hands, young men from town who were grateful for the steady work. The place hummed with activity again, the way it had when Sarah was alive. But the biggest change was on the ridge, at Sarah's grave. Caleb had commissioned a memorial, not a larger headstone. She wouldn't have wanted that, but a bronze plaque on a natural stone set into the ground beside her marker. The inscription read, Sarah Hayes, 1952 to 2022. Her death was not in vain. Through her, justice was served, truth was revealed, and the land she loved was secured for generations to come. Caleb visited the grave every evening, usually with Rusty, sometimes alone. He'd tell Sarah about his day, about the ranch's progress, about the future he was building. He liked to think she could hear him, that somehow she knew what her suffering had ultimately led to, not just Thorne's imprisonment, but awareness and reform that would protect others. The environmental contamination case had sparked a state investigation into mining practices across Montana. New regulations had been passed, enforcement strengthened. Other victims of Thorne's schemes had come forward, using Caleb's case as a template for their own justice. In a strange way, Sarah's death had saved lives by preventing future poisonings. It didn't make it right. Nothing could make it right. But it gave meaning to something that had seemed meaninglessly cruel. Tom stopped by on a late autumn evening, finding Caleb on the porch. Where else? Watching the sun set over land that had never looked more beautiful. Brought you something, Tom said, handing over a newspaper. The Copper Ridge Gazette, with a front-page story. Local ranch to host agricultural education program. Caleb had announced it the week before. Using a portion of the copper profits, he was establishing a program to teach young people about ranching and land stewardship. Students from across the state would be able to spend summers at the Hayes Ranch, learning the skills that had sustained his family for 3 generations. Thought you might want to save that, Tom said, for posterity. Sarah would have loved this, Caleb said quietly. She always said the ranch was meant to be shared, not just held on to. She'd be pleased to know kids will learn here. I think she'd be pleased about a lot of things. The way you fought for what was right. The way you turned something terrible into something good. Caleb pulled out his father's watch, an action so automatic now he barely registered it. The inscription caught the last rays of sunlight. May you always have time to do what's right. I've been thinking about this watch, he said, about what my father meant when he gave it to me. I always thought it was about having enough time to act on your principles, but maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he just meant that you should always make time for what matters, no matter how busy life gets. Sounds like something your father would say. When I die, and that's not a morbid thought, just a fact, I'm leaving the ranch to the education program, setting up a trust so it can never be sold, only used to teach people about the land and how to care for it. That feels right. Tom nodded slowly. Your grandfather would approve. Hell, he'd probably say it's about time someone did something useful with all this rock and sage. They laughed together, the sound carrying across the desert evening. Rusty's tail thumped against the porch boards, the old dog content now that his world had settled into peaceful routine. You know what the strangest thing is? Caleb said. I spent 3 years thinking my life was over, that without Sarah, without the ranch's future secure, I was just waiting to die. But now, he gestured at the land around them, at the thriving ranch, at the future he'd built from the ashes of despair. Now I feel like I'm just getting started. You're 68 years old, Caleb. Exactly. I've probably got another good 20 years in me. Maybe more. That's 20 years to make this place what it should be. 20 years to help young people learn what matters. 20 years to honor Sarah's memory by living well. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that never got old, no matter how many thousands of times you'd seen them. Somewhere beneath them, copper veins ran through the earth, a fortune hidden for a century and finally revealed by something as simple as a pile of mysterious dirt. Life was strange that way. You could spend decades not knowing what you were standing on, what secrets lay beneath the surface. Then one day something forces you to dig deeper, and everything changes. Caleb had dug deeper, literally and figuratively, and found not just copper but purpose, found not just money but meaning, found not just justice but peace. Before we jump back in tomorrow, he said to Tom, echoing the words he'd heard himself speak what felt like a lifetime ago, I want you to know I'm grateful for your friendship, for your help, for believing in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself. Tom stood, stretched, prepared to head home. That's what friends do, Caleb. That's what's right. After Tom left, Caleb sat alone on his porch, Rusty at his feet, his father's watch ticking steadily in his pocket. The stars emerged one by one, silver punctures in the darkening sky. Somewhere on the ridge, Sarah rested beneath stone and sky, her memorial testament to a life that had mattered, a death that had meaning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities. The education program would start in the spring, the mine would continue producing, the ranch would thrive. But tonight, Caleb Hayes sat on the land his grandfather had claimed and his father had preserved, and he allowed himself to simply be a man who had fought for what was right and won, a man who had turned loss into legacy. The bump in the barn had been annoying at first, then mysterious, then revelatory. It had changed everything, just as the story promised it would. But the real discovery hadn't been the copper, valuable as it was. The real discovery was simpler and more profound, that justice, though slow, could still prevail, that ordinary men could still win against powerful ones, that doing what's right, even when it's hard, even when the odds seem impossible, still mattered. May you always have time to do what's right. Caleb had used his time well, and he had plenty more ahead of him.